How are you feeling about the Jags Vikings game? Let's dive into this. This was a 12-7. So just some. I didn't pull up the stats. Let me see if I have it by memory. So they won 12-7. I don't think for any, if you watch the game, I don't think there was, even when they were down 0-7 for a while. Then they scored a field goal, and then they scored another field goal, and then they scored another. It was 4 field goals is what they won with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was any point where you were. So I started watching the game. I think they were 7-6 at that point. They were down. So I was kind of following it on the NFL app, and it was like, man, this looks horrible. They're down. You were talking about some picks. We were texting back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then when I started watching the game, it was like, they're dominating this game.
Yeah.
Like, you never felt like the Jaguars were going to win, even when they were ahead.
Yeah.
So Minnesota had over 400 yards, total yards of offense. I don't think the Jaguars broke 150 yards of offense. Did they? You look like maybe you were looking at something. You don't have to look it up, but I just thought maybe.
Yeah. I have some stats in front of me.
They were. Minnesota had over 400. I think I want to say it was like 143 yards. Minnesota had more yards, more plays in the Jacksonville side of the field than Jacksonville had the whole game. Minnesota had over 80 plays. And the time of possession was like Minnesota had close to 50 minutes of possession. Jacksonville had under 20, I believe.
Yeah.
Like this was an absolutely dominating game. What I told you was their best.
Did you say the total yards?
I think it was over. Minnesota had over 400.
It was 402 to 143.
143. Yeah, that's what I thought it was. This was arguably Minnesota's best offensive game of the year.
Right.
And yet it was their worst offensive against a terrible team. Sam Darnold throws 3 interceptions, all which should have been touchdowns. Now, granted, the one interception clearly hits the ground, so it should have really only been 2. But it shouldn't have even been thrown to the defender. Yeah, what are your thoughts as you bask in the amazing dominance of the Vikings?
I have generalized anxiety, so I'm always going to be anxious, and I'm always anxious, like going into a Vikings game. I wasn't that anxious going into this Vikings game, but I think it was like after the first interception, maybe, that it just started ramping up, and so I don't think that's a good clue of necessarily how they played, because
whether you feel anxious or not.
That's just me. But then pretty quickly, as I was like evaluating the game, it really was. It was so different. And I was listening to some other Vikings podcasts, so like some of this is coming from like places like thoughts from like Score North and Locked On Vikings and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But like it's so different than in the very frustrating era of Kirk Cousins, where you knew Kirk Cousins was an incredible quarterback. His accuracy, he could place the ball like on the boundaries. He could place the ball right where it's either like Diggs or Thielen or Jefferson or nobody. And like you knew there was this talent, and there should have been this chemistry. And I think eventually with Jefferson and Connell there was chemistry. But you would be in a dire situation, needing to get a field goal at least or a touchdown, and you get on your defense would make a stop, you get on the field, and it'd be 3 and out.
Yeah.
And then it's like, all right, well, we still got 3 quarters. Defense makes a play, they stop them or they give up a touchdown or something. You come back on, it's like, oh right, we need to get a touchdown. When you start getting touchdowns, and it would be 3-0, and you just do that for a whole game, and you would have incredible plays like the Buffalo game in 22 and the Indianapolis game in 22, where you made these great comebacks. I think it was the Chiefs game last year where we were actually pretty close, closer than what the score was. Um, but then you just have these like blank games where it's like Cousin just turned off for a game and just like a whole bunch of punts. And
Yeah.
I say all that to say that I think one of the reasons it feels so different for Vikings fans is that we're moving the ball down the field. We're like you were just set up. We dominated the offensively. We dominated. We did exactly what we were supposed to do against a terrible Jaguars team. And if it wasn't for 3 red zone interceptions, if those 3 red zone interceptions are converted to touchdowns and we get the extra points, that's 21 points added on. That's like 33 points.
33
Because
to 7.
yeah, those were interceptions. And so all of these field goals we got were other drives that we went down, got into field goal range, and like, you know,
Yeah.
weren't quite able to make it, and Darnold didn't try to force it to Jefferson, and so kicked a field goal. So all that to say, like I do feel encouraged. And I don't. It's not just cope. Like it's you look at the stats, you listen to the game, you realize we truly did dominate. We were supposed to dominate. We've been in games against against the Lions. We've been in, except for the Rams game, which was just a weird. The vibes were off. Um, like yeah, the Rams game and maybe a little bit the Colts game, but it did feel like the Colts game was a little bit of a okay, we're getting back, we're recovering from like a couple of losses. And then this game, if it's not for those 3 interceptions, which is a quarterback issue, it is a timing issue with like Jefferson, like they were talking about Locked On Vikings, how like the timing, like some of those interceptions actually weren't entirely Donald's fault. I mean, I do think he's still to blame for it because there were other people open. He tends to spend a lot of time in the pocket, but like the a couple of times Jefferson just wasn't Jefferson in those moments, and he was forcing it to Jefferson, and usually that's fine. Um, and it just wasn't in those times, and so like you take those 3 interceptions away, and we did exactly what we were supposed to do. We did exactly what um what we would have expected the Vikings to do. And so, I mean, I think that's just what you're going to get. I don't think Darnold is ever going to play worse than what he did, and we came away with a win. And people are going to throw the Vikings under the bus because of this game, but not Goff, who threw 5 interceptions and won by a smaller margin against a team that we dominated. Like we beat
Yeah.
them 30. What was it, 34-7 or whatever? Like we destroyed the Texans.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
what I have to say.
Yeah. No, I echo it. I think, yeah, very simply, this, yeah, I think the things that create anxiety for Vikings fans is there definitely was a point, especially after the 2 interceptions and Vikings are not getting on the board and the
Yeah.
Jaguars put a touchdown
Yeah.
across. We
Just
had,
like marched right down the field.
yeah, and we had, you and I going into the game, we had this as a 40 burger at least for the
Yeah.
Vikings. Because the Jaguars are so weak in the pass, and that's the strength of the
Yeah.
Vikings offense and all this. Yeah, this was not that. It should have been probably, but there was definitely a point where it felt like classic Minnesota sports, right? We're falling
Yeah.
apart on a team that you should beat.
Yeah.
And there's a disappointment and even anxiety in the sense that you should have crushed these guys. But I've been thinking about this and looking at some things. First of all, they won. They found a way to win. And this has to be the bottom, right? So just for some
Yeah.
context, there have been before the the Vikings Jaguars game on Sunday, there had been 195 straight games. I don't even know how far back it goes beyond that. I think this goes back to 2000. So 24 years or so, 195 games where the quarterback threw 0 touchdown passes and 3 interceptions. In those games before the Jacksonville Vikings game, teams that had the starting quarterback throw 0 touchdowns and 3 interceptions were 0-195. There had never been a win. So the Vikings literally statistically saying won an impossible game. At the how much lower can you get? I guess Darnold can go throw 5 interceptions or whatever. But we've seen the height of what Darnold can do, which is MVP caliber play. I don't think that's Darnold. I didn't think it was Darnold dominating the Niners and Texans. I don't think that's Darnold on a regular basis, but we see that he can do that. This is Darnold's low, absolute lowest. They, like you said, they still moved the ball. It wasn't just a flat like we've seen so much with Cousins. And with Cousins, I think one of the things that I appreciate differently about Darnold and Cousins is Darnold starts off hot and moves the ball well. And I don't know if that's an O'Connell thing, because it often felt like Cousins started off cold and they're down 21 points.
Yeah.
And then Cousins starts throwing the ball out the wazoo, and they come back and get within 3, and the game looks great. And sometimes they pull off these fourth quarter comebacks. And I had this little spat going on with a Falcons fan on Twitter because I was actually commenting. I think Phil Mackey had a post, and then a Falcons fan commented on that. Yeah. He was like, "Why do you Vikings fans just hang around?" And I was just like, "Hey, we had him for 6 years. I think we can predict a little bit,
speak on this issue." Yeah.
And then he cites back to me all these stats of his fourth quarter comebacks and all these things, and I'm like,
so hard.
It's exactly what Vikings fans did when we're stuck with the largest contract in quarterback. I guess Dak outdid Cousins' contract now, but you're stuck with it. You got to somehow find a way to hope. But we've predicted those checkdowns in key moments. That is Cousins. That's what Cousins does in the key moments. And anyway, I feel like Darnold moves the ball right away. He gets that going quickly. The problem is, and so many of his interceptions have been red zone interceptions. And so somehow that, if the Vikings are going to go deep into the playoffs, that's got to be fixed. And I don't know if that's a fixable thing or what, but I already talked about the one that hopefully this is the bottom. How much worse can it get? But there's 2 things that I see from this game, and one in particular that kind of is maybe we shouldn't be feeling so bad. Have you noticed what opposing teams have done against the Jaguars recently?
No, I do not. I haven't really followed them.
Yeah. No, I hadn't either. I just was looking into this and I was like, oh, interesting. So in week 9, the Eagles beat them by 5.
Okay.
In week 8, the Packers beat them by 3. In week 7,
greater margin.
The Jags won.
About 5.
In week 5, the Jags won. In week 4, Texans beat them by 4.
Who did the Jags beat?
The Jags beat the Colts, and I forget who the second. I skipped the Bears game in London where they blew them out 35-16 or something.
The Bears blew them out?
The Bears blew them out in week 6.
Oh.
But against the Eagles, the Packers, the Texans, they've had close games against.
Yeah. These playoff caliber supposed to be really good teams.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to see what happens with Detroit. I expect Detroit to go in and blow them out. Detroit does that against bad teams. But it just kind of was like, oh, so they've actually played close games against playoff caliber teams. So as a Minnesota fan, it's like we've mentioned this several weeks now. Darnold is who Darnold is. He's going to throw interceptions. He's going to have some big plays every now and then. We have the best defense in the league. I mean, it depends what you're looking at. We're third in the whole NFL. We have the third fewest points allowed in all of the NFL. We lead the NFC in fewest points allowed. If you're looking at fantasy points, so that's going to highlight sacks and turnovers and fewer points allowed, fewest yardage allowed. Like you get fantasy points for those metrics. Minnesota's leading by over 10 in as far as defense. It might be over 20 as far as defensive points in fantasy leagues. So like we have a top 5 defense, top 3. I would argue at the moment the best defense. And my kids are eating breakfast and singing songs. Can you hear that? I don't know if that's coming through, but it's fairly loud. At least it's cheerful noises.
Yeah.
So yeah. Now they're shouting. So yeah, comparative to other playoff caliber teams that have played the Jaguars, like, yeah, those games were all over 20 points, but the Jaguars played with them. We held them down, should have dominated them, thanks to, like, everybody in the Vikings played exceptional, except Darnold. And that Darnold is the X factor.
Darnold, 3 throws. Like, I know they're interceptions, so you can't ignore them, but they are 3 throws. Otherwise, he didn't have the greatest, pass to incompletion ratio, but like we've been saying, he moved the ball down the field.
Yeah, no, he did better. But the second thing that I'd like to highlight is, once again, and this is something that's irking me a little bit on this Tuesday morning. There's 2 things irking me. First of all, you don't hear like the Steelers pull out this win and like, are the Steelers the most dominant team? The Lions pull out a win where they were absolutely dominated. And I think you need to continue to give the Lions flowers, because except for the Bucks in week 2 or 3, they've been beating everybody. But why doesn't anybody talk about the Vikings? The Vikings have the same record as the Steelers. The Vikings have a better defense than the Steelers, and the Steelers are known for their defense. But what's really irking me is that Kevin O'Connell's not showing up anywhere in Coach of the Year conversation. And I would argue that the win over the Jaguars proves once again that the Minnesota Vikings are the best coached team in the NFL right now. You're working with perhaps the weakest link quarterback in all the NFL right now.
And weakest links.
Yeah. and creating schemes where guys are open, creating schemes where, like, O'Connell is doing a very good job at working with a guy whose career was washed up. He's going to have this guy cash in on a big payday with somebody next year.
Yeah.
Mike Tomlin, I understand it's kind of a cool thing to have, like, oh, he's made a lot with 2 QBs. He actually hasn't. Like, people keep talking about, like, when you have 2 QBs, you have no QB. Mike Tomlin has never once had 2 QBs. He's always had 1 QB. And 1 QB got injured, and so he said Fields is the QB. And then he made a decisive moment of, like, now we're going back to Russ. And so there's never been, like, the media's made plenty of hash about it. And I understand maybe there's still kind of a cool thing with what he's done with the Steelers with these 2 QBs who people had kind of given up on. But I still argue that O'Connell deserves
Yeah,
way more conversation. Even I would argue even more than Dan Campbell, as cool of a story as that is,
right.
and as great of a job. But O'Connell, as far as pure coaching, like making the best of what you have, I don't see why he's not in the conversation.
Yeah, I would I agree with you. I think I would quibble. I don't know that if you're talking about weakest, depending on what you're meaning by weakest link, I would say that there are definitely worse quarterbacks playing right now. Um, but as far as like in a chain that is strong enough to like go into the playoffs, Darnold is probably the weakest link of any competitive teams. Um,
Yeah, that's a good correction. I'm thinking I don't think Darnold makes a team competitive. Like I've never
sure,
once thought going into this season, throughout the season,
yeah,
I've never once thought the Vikings are good because of Darnold. And I don't
yeah.
think he would do that for any team. Like that's how low
Where
I am on Darnold.
Yeah, the Vikings are good because we have a team that is all like the players are all in, um, just team wide, which is a coaching thing. We have like a defensive madman calling plays, and we have Jefferson, Hawkinson, and Addison. Like we have arguably one of the best receiving cores in the NFL, if not the best. But then the thing that makes that all work with Sam Darnold is like again to your point, coaching. Um,
Yeah.
I don't
And
I don't know I don't know why. Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say too, because a lot of people like I forget who I was watching, ESPN or somebody is like, why is Darnold having the year that he is? And somebody said Justin Jefferson. I think that's naivety. You're not watching a lot of NFL. There are other QBs that are
Yeah,
stinking right now that have incredible weapons. Like, yeah,
yeah,
I'm bothered by the fact that like, oh, it's yes, Justin Jefferson is the best wide receiver in the league, and we need to be getting him more targets. Jordan Addison, if he was on almost any other team,
yeah,
would be a number one wide receiver.
yeah,
But there are lots of QBs who stink and have really good weapons around them. That I guess that's part of what I'm looking at is like that's an O'Connell thing. Like the fact that O'Connell is maximizing the weapons and he's elevating a mediocre, maybe even bottom 10 QB to play at a competitive level. Anyways, what were you going to say?
yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know the coach of the year thing. Like, I think Campbell should have been. I don't remember if he was in competition for it or not, but like, feels like last year would have been a better like coach of the year because this year they're just dominating, which is coaching, but I don't necessarily know that that's what gets you the coach of the year. I think coach of the year usually comes from people who have had who have played as teams have played as well as they do in large part because of the coaching. Last year it was Kevin Stefanski with the Browns and their whole like five quarterback miss. With the Steelers, I mean, I do think Tomlin should be in the conversation, but yeah, like Kevin O'Connell hasn't been in the conversation since like week 4 or 5. Um, I remember hearing people talk about his name in that sense, but then we lost to two competitive teams and haven't heard it since.
So
Um,
O'Connell, just to clarify, has O'Connell ever been in conversation outside of Minnesota sports? Because I'm not sure I've
I
ever heard
heard
him on.
Good Morning Football talked about it like one of the early
Oh, really?
weeks. Yeah.
I missed that.
Um, I I forget if it was a segment about it or if it was um kind of leading up to them interviewing him because he went on Good Morning Football like week 3 or 4. Um,
Okay.
I think it was week maybe 4 or 5. Um, and so I think they may have like bandied it about in that context, but
Hmm.
um, but yeah, like I guess I don't really know what gets you coach of the year. What who won 2 years ago? I mean,
So
it was
Dable
oh yeah,
won
Table.
when I would have argued O'Connell should have won as well. But
I, if yeah, I mean this so obviously this Vikings team hasn't have they haven't they haven't won a playoff game under Kevin O'Connell. But that's not what gets you coach of the year. That's not what I'm saying.
yeah,
Um, but if like I think this team has always been underrated. Um, I think in its history, but particularly under the O'Connell regime, because like just see the competitiveness with which they have played over the last 3 years versus the Giants, who were at the very most equals to the Vikings in 2022. And Daniel Jones just had the game of his career that got him a $40 million against the Vikings, and Kirk Cousins kind of blank screened at the end of the game. Um,
yeah, I would say they
but
were
then
not equals. But yeah,
yeah, but like that was their ceiling, wasn't equal to
yeah,
the Vikings.
yeah.
And their record wasn't equal that year either. Um, but then since then, the Giants have completely fallen apart, both subsequent years, and the Vikings have stayed steady and improved.
Even
Maybe
when
not in
they
record
had,
so far. Even when they had their MVP run quarterback have an Achilles, it,
yeah,
or his Achilles.
with backup QBs, Kevin O'Connell played 500 ball.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess it would be interesting to go over and see like the last 10 coaches of the year and see like what the narrative was around those teams. But I don't know. I think
Yeah,
the Vikings are very happy historically to stay middle of the road. Um, and so I think it's a combination of being from flyover country, from being like a middle of the road team with with like some fairly famous implosions in like prime moments
yeah.
that I think teams just I mean not teams sports commentators just kind of forget about them. I don't think that like everybody who talks about Kevin O'Connell has respect for him when they do
So
talk about